How do families contribute to social inequality? What are some of the effects of family disharmony on family members? How do we as sociologists understand the different makeup of families and how these relationships are defined? How do we explain the basic features that are shared amongst families, including the type of relationships they share and the type of care that they provide? How are contemporary families and domestic life structured? How do we make sense of new trends in family and domestic life? In this episode of Social Problems, we're talking all about families and social problems associated with family life. So sit back, grab a snack, let's get to it. My name is Dr. Derek Silva, and I'm an associate professor of criminology studying harm and injustice in the world. In today's episode of Social Problems, we're talking all about families. How are families structured in contemporary life? And what problems are associated with the family? Indeed, when they form a family, few people imagine how stressful family life can be at times. But for some families, a high degree of stress is recurrent, continuous, and negatively impacts families in a number of ways. Often, extreme stress reduces a family's ability to work well and function in contemporary life. And for that reason, sociologists are keenly interested in how family members cope with and adjust to long term stressors. Some common causes of family stress tend to fall into at least four categories: major upheavals, such as war or natural disaster; major life transitions, such as the birth of a child, the death of a loved one, divorce, career change, or retirement; chronic stressors, such as ability and disabilities; severe physical or mental illness, substance abuse, occupational problems, housing insecurity, unemployment, or incarceration of a family member; or occasional stressors, such as car accidents, forms of victimization, and family vacations. Many of these stressors can be compounded by what social psychologists call acculturative stress, which is the psychological strain of adapting to a new or unfamiliar culture. For example, children of immigrants have been shown to adapt quickly to new or unfamiliar cultures, which can produce tension and conflict between immigrant parents and children. Chronic stressors that confront families most often include economic stress. For example, single mothers are particularly vulnerable to economic and social stressors in Canada. Systemic racism and discrimination are other sources of chronic stress that particularly impacts already marginalized families. These effects can make family and domestic life incredibly difficult for folks who already face a number of social barriers in life. In your read, watch, and respond, please answer the following question: what are the categories of family stress, and what are some examples and implications of each? This chapter introduces the topic of families and discusses how families exist and how family structure may differ across societies. The chapter discusses the myths that are continued to be believed regarding the family structure, including the definition of so called ideal families. Despite the various definition of families, there are some characteristics that the ideal, so called typical family is expected to share in society. There are several different family structures, and they all follow the expectations of a typical family and deviate from these expectations in a variety of ways. In Canada, common law status refers to whether the person is living with a person of the opposite sex or of the same sex as a couple, but is not legally married to that person. Common law union is the fastest growing family category in Canada today. The proportion of common law couples increased from 6.3% to 21.3% in 1981 2016. As a result of this pattern, a growing number of Canadian children are born to unmarried parents, and this is particularly so in Quebec. 1 in 3 births in Canada are to unmarried women, most of whom are cohabiting or living with their partner in a non marriage union. In Quebec, this rate is approximately 60%, indicating a clear trend in contemporary families away from marriage and to common law or cohabiting unions. Indeed, young adults are much more likely to cohabit than to get married in their first relationship and to experience numerous relationships through their lives than ever before. Cohabiting relationships do, however, tend to be less stable than marital relationships. This instability can pose a number of problems for family members, especially for the most dependent, such as the youngest and oldest family members. Divorce is a particularly large stressor for families. Until the 1960s, getting a divorce was a challenge as one had to demonstrate that the spouse had shown fault, often through adultery. The Divorce Act of 1968 adjusted how divorce could be attained. With the Divorce Act, it was possible to divorce on the basis of marital breakdown. This was a welcome addition for a number of reasons and highlighted the problems with how pre-Divorce Act law dealt with power relations brought about by structural patriarchy, which you will recall is defined as a system of government that is male dominated and justified in a society's system of values that privileges men and men's experiences. Families built around same-sex couples have been maligned in many societies, yet the empirical evidence overwhelmingly suggests that these families are incredibly stable and family responsibilities are performed consistently well. Same-sex parents have repeatedly challenged the legal and cultural definitions of spouse and applied to courts to formalize the relationships with their adopted children. In doing so, they have challenged the normative content of spousal relations, changed the law itself as a gendering strategy in contemporary life. As part of a decades-long fight for equity and equality before the law, Bill C-7, or the Civil Marriages Act, was passed in 2005. And validates the legality of marriage between same-sex couples in Canada. Heterosexual couples remain the most common family type in Canada, but those trends are changing over time. Between 2006 and 2016, the number of same-sex couples increased by 60%, while the number of heterosexual couples increased by only 9.6%. In 2017, same-sex couples in Canada reached 1% of the population, or approximately 380,000. Which remains higher than peer countries like the US, Australia, and the UK. Societies around the globe are having fewer children than ever before, and there are several important factors that may explain why fertility rates have declined in Canada. And these are outlined in the chapter. The chapter points out the delay in child rearing occurring in Canada and identifies causes of the trend, which do include the rise of cohabitation, the rising cost of living, and vocational expectations that might cause couples to delay child rearing, the decline in religious influence on contemporary life, and changes in the division of labor in society. For example, declines in fertility rates exist in many American, Asian, and European countries. In some regions, like West Africa, fertility rates have not declined significantly. In Canada, fewer women are giving birth in their 20s, and there have been a steady increase in the number of women giving birth in their 30s. Canadian fertility is very similar to that of Northern and Central Europe, Russia, China, and Australia. There is also a trend called the boomerang effect, which refers to young adults returning to the parental home after their first entrance into the so-called adult world, after failed marriages, due to delayed marriage or completing education, or with difficulties finding stable work. The rise of boomeranging is strongly gendered. In 2016, 5 men for every 4 women aged 20 to 34 lived with their parents. Finally, but interestingly, sociologists are eagerly awaiting studies that explore COVID-19's impact on family and domestic life in Canada. Importantly, the chapter devoted much attention to Indigenous families, which are often overlooked in Canadian society. Due to the reality of violent and forced segregation of Indigenous peoples through the residential schooling system, the traditional system of child rearing practices for Indigenous Canadians has been largely stolen from Indigenous. The Truth and Reconciliation process attempts to rectify some of the long-term consequences of forced cultural loss, but as we know, there has not been close to the necessary action needed to actually reconcile what Canada has taken from Indigenous families. Indeed, Indigenous women face their own specific set of problems. For example, until recently, if they married outside of the Indigenous community, they would lose their Indian status in front of the law, which has had immeasurable effects on the erasure of Indigenous languages, culture, and family structure. The same rule, however, did not apply to Indigenous men, again highlighting the role of patriarchy in structuring Canadian society and even Indigenous society. As victims of ongoing systemic assimilation attempts by mainstream Canadian society and the Canadian government, many Indigenous families struggled to adapt to contemporary life in this country. The brutal, violent, and incredibly harmful conditions of residential schools violently forced assimilation and attempts to steal Indigenous culture from communities that had a negative impact on the breakdown of traditional cultural values. This has incredibly harmful effects on the transmission of Indigenous cultural knowledges, parental and child rearing practices, and this has negatively impacted Indigenous families still today. These experiences and the intergenerational trauma, in addition to consequences of structural racism and violent discrimination, has in many ways resulted in high rates of alcohol and drug use and dependency, as well as mental health issues that have caused increased rates of suicide amongst Indigenous communities. Understanding these historical traumas is absolutely necessary and must be accomplished through the ongoing re education of Canadian society to gain missing knowledge about ongoing issues caused by settler colonialism. Understanding these traumas helps us take into account how the consequences of settler colonialism and systemic discrimination against a group may accumulate over generations and interact with proximal stressors to undermine collective well being and stable family life. As we have discussed, in 2015, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission published 94 calls to action that necessitate action to be undertaken by all Canadians in advance of acknowledging harms to Indigenous peoples and actions that can help us begin to reconcile those harms. These are not optional for Canada. These are necessary actions that we must undertake. Indeed, Indigenous women in particular have been victimized by discriminatory policies that have impacted family life. The history of sexist policies has caused paternalistic values to seep into Indigenous communities. Historically, many Indigenous societies were mostly egalitarian. Today, Indigenous women have lost a number of their roles in family, community, and culture. Many also suffer from high rates of domestic and family violence that is often perpetrated by men. In your read, watch, and respond, please answer the following question. Explain some of the additional problems faced by Indigenous families. What effects have these processes had on their families and parenting practices? The structural functionalist believes that the family is an integral part of society and is necessary for the nurturing and socializing roles. In other words, that the family is a microcosm of society. Functionalists tend to hold that a gendered division of labor is functional for society and social cohesion and proper functioning of the system itself. The family serves an important role in this, socializes children into functional roles in society, including relating to sexual behavior and reproduction, providing for physical and psychological family members, and understanding the division of labor and to train workers. Modern functionalism tended to argue that certain family structures are so-called natural or inevitable, again highlighting functionalism's predisposition for status quo. Conflict theorists believe that families operate to serve the best interests of the capitalist system as they form their own workforce with zero pay. Social reproduction in families supports the capitalist system, and families maintain and serve the workforce without remuneration. Conflict theorists hold that families must be understood historically and placed in the context of political and economic conflict. Families are no longer self-sustaining economic units, but are units of consumption dependent on outside sources of income for survival. Under advanced capitalism, traditional patterned household work by women is most always unpaid, which we also know is a trend called the double shift. It still exists today. So exploitation of women benefits the capitalist system because it benefits employers. Feminists believe that the labor divide and wage divide within the family are arbitrary and can and should be changed to facilitate greater equality and equity for women. Gender inequality arises out of economic exploitation. And feminists hold that the domestic division of labor is arbitrary and has nothing to do with sex or gender. Historically, women have been dependent on their spouses, which has turned into systemic subordination. While this may be changing, there are a number of trends that still exist today, such as expectations related to the double shift, or the set of expectations related to the duality of modern women's roles as both breadwinner and homemaker. While more and more women enter and succeed in the labor market, there remain a number of domestic expectations that lead to domestic work that is unpaid or relatively so. These expectations do not just exist in the home and labor market, but are built through the entire political and social fabric that remains structured on patriarchy. The capitalist economy has systematically affirmed old patriarchal tendencies by providing men different access to the labor market. They also look at the family through an intersectionality frame, where they see that white women have a different experience in their families than do Black or Indigenous women, or women who face additional barriers to a so called normative social life. Symbolic interactionists see the family as a primary socializing agent, and that myths about the family preserve the continuation of this family form. These folks examine the ways family members interact with one another and resolve conflicts in the family, because families involve continuous and ongoing interaction. They are maintained by shared myths and beliefs, and their main role is to socialize the next generation to be members of society. So-called family values build a shared definition of family goals, identity, and values that shape all family members and their interactions with society. Social constructivists also look at the role of the myth in the family dynamic. They're concerned about the ways that these myths shape the media's interpretation of the family and in turn beliefs held by moral entrepreneurs. They focus on how moral entrepreneurs are successful in changing or propagating myths and ideals about the family, which reinforce the family structure and the broader culture. These moral entrepreneurs have been widely successful in creating a number of moral panics about the decline of the so-called nuclear family, which has caused numerous social conflicts relating to the labor market and reproductive rights. In your read, watch, and respond, please answer the following question. Compare and contrast how roles of families in society are understood among structural functionalists, conflict theorists, and symbolic interactionists. Please use an example or a series of examples in your response. Well, that's it for today. I hope you learned something about families, patterns of social life, and some of the social problems associated with domestic life. This has been Professor Selva, and I'll catch you on the next episode of Social Problems.